And next up, we have co-creating a climate narrative in and through culture with Maggie Fox. Maggie's a consultant serving organizations, communities, foundations, and other philanthropic endeavors. She's the past president and CEO of the Climate Reality Project and Climate Action Fund. Thanks to Maggie for being here.
Good morning. It's nice to see you all, though it's a little bit hard with that light. I chose this topic on purpose. I've a long career in policy and politics and learned the hard way through a bunch of tough lessons over many years, whether it was in the context of wilderness legislation, climate change, or a number of other policy battles in my lifetime as well as in politics, that we're really good at coming up with a hodgepodge of policy prescriptions, and we're really bad at communicating in almost any other way. Over the last 40-some years, as everybody in this room knows, there's been a culture war in this country, begun on the right. We can divide the country into right and left, Democrat and Republican, conservative, liberal, progressive, and whatever. Doesn't really matter. The divisions are real, but they're also fueled, and fueled through a powerful set of cultural narratives that we have just begun to look at, much less learn how to share or employ as a strategy. The first thing I'd say is that the moment we're in right now has created a interesting, well, it's many things, but one thing that's clear is that all the political norms are falling away. And it's not just in this country, but it's all over the world that democracies are failing and flailing. So when we look at what we do to move forward on climate, or really any other big, powerful narrative story, we actually have to do a couple of things. On our side, because we haven't chosen communication as a principal goal, and we haven't been very curious about it for a very long time, it seems to me the most important thing about this next piece of work is actually to become curious and to step back many, many steps to look at ourselves, to look at human beings and how we actually communicate, to figure out where we can find, what tools we can use and what can we do to bridge the gap. Right now, the right dominates all political conversation in this country, whether it's over the biggest or the littlest kinds of fights. And our voices are often muted and stuck in facts that are untextured and not conceptualized or placed in a framework. We use conversations about work, ethic, and a number of other kind of political policy objectives that we have to think that we're actually communicating with people. My husband was in political life for almost 20 years, and in that time frame, I learned very personally and very powerfully that talking about policy is effectively not communicating at all. People have no idea. And even in that magnificent story about Flint, the one thing I was crying out for out of that whole horrendous, painful, deep wound is one voice, one face, one story that every single person in this country has had to see and hear. The plethora of stories is the backdrop. The one story is the digestible. So I chose this notion of talking about cultural narrative because the moment that we're in right now has us finally talking about narrative after years of catching up to first having a message, and then a message frame, or a slogan, or any of the ways we have of capturing people's attention about complex matters. But the truth of the matter is, narrative and cultural narrative are entirely different universes, and they are born out of different needs, they are created in different ways, and their delivery systems are hugely different. Early, when I agreed to do this today, this panel was to come behind me. And I was going to set up the conversation around cultural narrative because that's essentially what the work these panelists are doing is trying to find a way through cultural venues to tell stories that are large, complex, painful, and often also optimistic. Because the facts around them dull us and don't allow us to absorb these extremely powerful stories and then to have a sense of what we can do about it rather than lament or quietly celebrate. At the end of the day, right now, our narrative around climate is in the exact same place that our narrative or absence of narrative is around our political future, our world, our country, and our communities. We've not done the work. You have to first begin with ideas, powerful ideas that begin with first identifying values that we can actually share, and then finding the voices and stories that make those values come to life, come outside of being a word that has become a bit vague, like patriotism. What is that? And how is it expressed in a 21st century America, in a 21st century world where all the institutions and norms that we have leaned on for all of our lives and lives before us are collapsing under the weight of our cynicism and the inability to actually envision what their goals and responsibilities are. We've lost that sense of common connection and common story. So when I see the big opening of conversation about climate and about all the other things that we care about at Narrative, my heart is thrilled. But I'm also full of admonition. The first being that policy prescriptions are not a story, and that a message or a message frame is not a narrative, and a narrative is not a cultural connection. They're different pieces of a larger piece of work. And culture is the most powerful shaper of human behavior. It is the way we agree to live together. And all through time, culture has shaped all political institutions, all religious institutions, and all governments and communities. And yet we have left culture as sort of entertainment rather than the principal driver. And in that regard, we have lost a lot of ground. It's not ground that we can't recapture, but we can't recapture it by just saying we're going to create a frame or a phrase or a narrative. We've actually got to begin with being curious, really curious, and begin by stepping back and looking at human behavior, our so-called opposition's behavior, the behavior of people all over the world. The inability for us as a community and a culture ourselves who care so much about climate to reach any kind of breadth and understanding about this issue is not really very surprising when you look at human behavior in the social science. And yet we haven't done that. We haven't actually stepped back to do that work and to actually take heed with what we've learned and then do something with it rather than just learn about it. Today we're at that place where this moment has arrived. We have no choice. It's just about beginning well and sticking with the journey until we can create and actually co-create a narrative that we can share, which means we cannot just talk to each other. There are people, great voices out there, who are calling for resistance. And resistance is absolutely necessary when it comes to specific policies and actions like Flint that have to change. But we have to build. No is insufficient. It's always in all of time been insufficient. No is never where we're going. So what are the three most powerful pieces of a narrative, be it a cultural narrative or otherwise? One is that it actually has to be true. If you are out there approaching telling a story and there's any hint of falsity about it, people can smell it, even if they can't articulate it. The second is you must find authentic voices who are telling that story. There have to be faces and voices of people who are embodying that narrative rather than just words. The way they look, the lives they've lived, and their one and powerful individual story. And the third is it actually has to be aspirational. As human beings, so our gloom and doom climate, which we've all finally learned doesn't work, never was going to work, never will work, because each of us, we have that shadow side. We are the best of ourselves, we are the worst of ourselves. So any narrative that's to move us has to have a hint of our shadow, but show us the other choice that we can make. It actually must embody both the shadow and the aspiration, but the aspiration actually has to feel real, attainable, and personal to me. That's true, and there's nothing I'm saying that isn't like what you know. What we've failed to do is apply that knowledge and the way we treat each other as human beings in our own tribe to create narrative that brings others with us, to us, that we can travel together. I was at a conference recently in Santa Barbara, and there was another speaker, and she did a really beautiful job. And one of the questions at the end was, and I agreed with some massive amount of what she said. But at the end, someone said, you know, it's such a difficult time. We're all pulled in so many ways. How do we make choices? You know, who do we talk to? And she said, well, we just don't have time but to talk to each other. There's so much happening. Meanwhile, she had spent the entire evening outlining the chaos theory and how the plethora of radical changes that are coming out of the Trump administration are done not by accident, but on purpose, to keep us off keel and unable to focus and realign ourselves. So the truth is that that is actually the wrong answer, and I totally disagree with, which is that our conversation about everything we care about actually has to begin by crossing the room to the other side, whatever that may be, and putting oneself in a position where we are learning, again, where those values are, because a narrative, a cultural narrative, is not just for me and mine. It's for all of us. We cannot live together. We don't succeed as a society, totally separate from the facts of climate. No society in history has made it without finding that narrative and having it sustain them through the best and the worst of times. There's an adage in politics. Some of them are stupid and some of them wear out, but some of them are hang for many years because they're just true. One is that Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line. And when we don't fall in love, we don't show up, but they always fall in line. Why does that matter when I talk about narrative? Because narrative on the right is centralized, singularly created, and delivered through complex mechanisms of think tanks, message components, media components. We don't centralize. And I finally learned we're not gonna. We're not. So in order to create this cultural narrative of a 21st century world that we long to reach into with each other, because we aren't going any other way, we have to reach beyond. And we have to create a narrative that includes everyone, not just our tribe, or our sub-tribes, or our movements and our sub-movements. Because all of those movements are inside a larger cultural narrative, and that cultural narrative has to be big enough to include us all. At the end of the day, after a lot of years of advocacy and law, politics, and policy, I've learned a couple of things I would share with you. the shortest distance between two people is a story. And the only universal language in the world is music. When we employ story, music, connection, then a climate narrative is just one piece of a larger narrative, which is one piece of how we find our way in a 21st century world. Documentaries and films and music and dance are not lesser, they are more. They are where we can see a future together. Look at Hamilton and the extraordinary critical acclaim. What is Hamilton but the first investment to define a 21st century democracy and a shared history? If it was described that way in the beginning, people would have to decide whether they were going because of their political affiliations. But fortunately, the music, the dance, the power, the history, the teaching, the passion is available to everyone, because we all are everyone, and we make it together. So I would say to those of you who have begun the work of narrative, don't think you know what you're doing, because you don't. Like me, you will have made a bunch of mistakes, and that's the first place to check where your learning should begin. When you start to do narrative work, realize that you might first be thinking about creating a message, not a narrative. And you might actually be thinking about creating a slogan that expresses a moment in time. That's not a narrative. Nor is a narrative, a cultural narrative is not a suite of words. It's a cluster of stories that come together to expose and explore values that we share together. When we do that, then these admonitions to collaboration, these admonitions to actually figuring out how to work together rather than talking about it, these admonitions about actually creating strategies and sharing what people are becoming to call dirt, which I love this phrase. Dirt is his way of sharing assets, or like this young man's offer to share his communication tools. We shouldn't have to have so many of the same things. We don't really need all of them. We just need to share them, which means we need a story that will allow us to do that. Policy prescriptions may be wonderful, but they capture no heart, and they do not drive this country, and they do not make a difference. I would leave you with one last phrase. There's a book I read back in college in the last several months. I woke up in the middle of the night, in the weirdest, out of a dream about a book and a title. And I'm lying there, like, what is this? And what it came to my mind was, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what I thought, I said, is this my dream of, am I creating this? I wish. It's actually been written. It was written in the 70s, but we forgot to read it. Culture doesn't just eat strategy for breakfast. Culture eats politics for an amuse-bouche. And unless and until we understand that the river of culture is where the path to the future lies, we will be digging ditches in the dirt on the side in policy and politics. Thank you.